Cognitive dissonance is, the best thing to do is to talk about what combines to get there. So you have cognitions, which are thoughts or pieces of knowledge. When you combine thoughts and pieces of knowledge into some sort of paradigmatic construction, we call it a schema or a cognitive schema. It's sort of how we interpret events, how we interpret the past, how we contemplate the future. There are all sorts of schemas. We need them for everything, to interpret every little bit of our lives. But I just want to talk about two kinds. One is the social schema. A social schema is the schema that we use to help us understand our relationships with other people, whether it is a friend, whether it is a group of people, whether it is, for me, like my students or another professor. There's also self-schemas, and that's the ones where how we interpret who we are, how we think about the meaning of our lives, our past, our future. So one thing about the self-schema is that it tends to be the strongest schema that we have, the most stubborn, and that is because the more often you use a schema, the stronger it gets, and we tend to think about ourselves a lot. We think about how we're doing things, how we're going from point A to point B. So one of the things that happens when we exist in the world is that we are confronted with things that actually don't quite make sense to our schemas, whether it's our social schema or a self-schema. And when that happens, we have cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance is exactly sort of what it sounds like. It's like that, it's the opposite of harmony. It sounds wrong, it feels wrong. Usually there's all sorts of definitions. My old social psychology textbook has described it as the feeling of discomfort you get when you're doing something and it does not make sense within the context of the way that you think about yourself. Usually it's something that is negative against your positive experience. And I'll give you an example of how that might work. So I teach a big, huge class on HIV and AIDS, and the example I use is around an HIV diagnosis. So imagine you're the sort of person who's highly risk adverse. You think of yourself as very responsible. You go to the doctor every 6 months. You get tested regularly. And you have lots of plans for the world. You're going to have kids, you're going to travel, you're going to write 3 novels, you're going to live to 100. Well, one day, to your surprise, you get an HIV positive diagnosis after a test. You can imagine that would be kind of jarring if you had all these thoughts about your life. You're like, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. Well, people react in different ways. So when you have cognitive dissonance, you need to resolve it somehow. Now, how do you resolve this dissonance? You change the way you think. So let's say some people might respond, well, this is ridiculous. How could this possibly happen? The test is wrong. You mixed me up with someone else. I demand you redo the test. And just so you know, if you do get a positive test result, it's always redone. But usually you don't have to get angry to make that happen. You could also do what some people do, which is just walk away. And they don't think about it anymore. They pretend it never happened. That is not the best way to do it because usually it comes back to haunt you, particularly with a debilitating disease. But we can think of lots of ways that people do that with all sorts of information. Some people, though, take this as a pivotal moment in their life. This is a time where they can reevaluate who they are and what they're going to do. And they can change their ways, their schemas in sort of profound ways. So you can resolve your cognitive dissonance in many ways. Sometimes they are very unhealthy, and sometimes they can be transformative. So keep that in mind. Now, let's go to Michael. So I met Michael when I was 20. He was 19 in college. I saw him from far away, and he had wavy brown hair that was a little long, and he was gesticulating wildly. He was long and gangly, and I really did think he kind of looked like a Muppet. As I got to know him, that sort of wild gesticulation was pretty normal because he was always so excited about things, and he always had so much to say about everything. He's one of those people that had something interesting and profound and learned to say about just about anything, whether it was Bertolt Brecht or Andrew Jackson or Weezer. It was 1993. And you could talk to him about anything. He knew everything. He was incredibly talented. He was fascinating. He was weird. In college, we were friends. We weren't incredibly close, but we were friends. We did become close when he moved to New York. And We became close, particularly on the day that he decided to come out to me finally. I had thought so, but he came out to me. We walked around Columbus Circle, where we both had our first jobs. And a few months later, he moved in with me and my roommates in the Upper West Side. And that is actually the last picture taken in that apartment at our closing party right before we moved. There's a lot of Rolling Rock there, and I still wear that shirt. And we became very, very close. We were each other's wingmen in the gay bars downtown. We had, and this is a picture of us and our friend Curtis at a bar called Hell, which no longer exists. And I don't have that shirt anymore, but I love it. We had a lot of fun. It was the kind of relationship where you knew each other incredibly well. You could talk about anything. And because he was so brilliant and exciting, it was so much fun. Whether it was 1 o'clock in the morning at a bar and he's the first person that figured out what actually happened in Mulholland Drive. He was the person who I met every single Tuesday afternoon for lunch, and we'd walk in with our whatever we were reading, whether it was the New Yorker or the newspaper or a novel, and we would have incredibly fascinating conversations about everything. We had goofy times, whether it was the time that we made each other late for work because we had to stay home and watch the premiere of Backstreet's Back on TRL on MTV, which we did, and it was very important to us. And we had a great time. I mean, he was just the funniest guy. And I always think about this picture as my favorite picture of him because it's ridiculous, but it's sort of beautiful. He's chasing ducks. This picture is from 2015, many years later, and it's taken at the Williamstown Theater Festival. At this point, he'd become a fixture in American theater. While I struggled in publishing in New York and didn't really have the greatest time, he became known as a genius. He was one of the most important sort of songwriters out there. He wrote songs that were so inventively weird, whether they were funny or they were profound, philosophical musings, rhymes that no one would ever think to do. They were funny, they made us cry, they haunted me, they made him very famous. At the age of 31, he won a Lifetime Achievement Award. He won an Obie for continuing excellence when he was 31. By this point, I had left New York and I went and got a PhD. But he was the only person in New York that I really, really kept up with. We talked a lot, texted, emailed, had lunches together if we were in the same place at the same time. I always stayed with him when I would visit in New York. But we had not talked for a few months. In fact, there was just a text message a few months before, September 9th, 2017, when he died of AIDS. It was shocking, to say the least. This is how I found out. So this Facebook post from our friend Adam, rest in peace, Michael Friedman, 41, hugely gifted composer and thinker, an unspeakable loss for the theater world, which is true. The shock and the confusion and the grief were equal. It was mind-boggling to me. Mind-boggling partly because I had no idea he was sick. Mind-boggling to me because, wait a minute, how did this guy do this? What was it? What happened? Turned out that he had not been tested for HIV for many, many years, and he had been getting sick and didn't think that something was wrong, or didn't say that something was wrong, even though he had probably the best known opportunistic infection for AIDS, which is Kaposi sarcoma, lesions on his face. He existed in a world where people knew what that was, but it just didn't make sense that was going on. And then in July of 2017, he did finally get diagnosed with HIV, but it was so advanced, he was also diagnosed with AIDS, and he died 2 months later of a lung infection. I wasn't the only one to say, what on earth is happening here? What could possibly have led this to happen? And I wasn't the only one, lots of us did it, and actually ended up in the New York Times, an actual article of everyone asking why. Because when you think about it, those of you who remember the 80s, if 1987 you saw a headline that said, brilliant 41-year-old Broadway composer dies of AIDS, that was common in 1987 in the New York Times. In 2017, it's bizarre. So, one of the things that drove me crazy, a little crazy about this article, but a lot of the questions why, were that people were saying, who dies of AIDS? That really says a lot about the speaker who's asking who dies of AIDS in 2017, because it really shows, well, you may not be aware of what's happening in the world. Because in 2017, 1 million people died of AIDS around the world. That is not because of what we imagined was happening in the United States, but it was 6,000 people died of AIDS in the United States in 2017. But who are those people? They're not the people that were quoted, that were known by the people quoted in this article. They are people that are poor, they live in rural areas, they aren't white, they tend to be someone, they're far away from an AIDS doctor, they don't know that the medications can be given to them for free. They may have difficulty taking the medications because of an addiction problem or a mental health problem, or because they have what we call in the research disordered lives. It's just really hard if you have a confusing life to make all these things work. So they do die. And it was frustrating to hear that people felt that didn't know, and they called me because, well, oh, right, Ted, he's the guy that, he became an HIV expert. And I would say, yeah, well, okay, they're like, oh, and I was like, yeah, it's upsetting. But it became a little bit more confusing because so within that, how could that have happened? What's going on? Like, why was he like this? Was he deluded? Why didn't he do anything? How could he not know what was going on? Did he not think what was happening? What is it? Had he had some emotional breakdown we didn't know about? And well, I had just taught that lecture that I briefly told you at the beginning of this talk. I just said, oh, it's clearly cognitive dissonance. This is a guy that was so in denial because of a massive amount of dissonance. This is what he did. And it was both a simple way of thinking about it, but also a really upsetting one, because to imagine the person, one of my closest friends in the world, was so profoundly upset by what was going on that there was such buzzsaw noise emotionally in his head of dissonance that he would deny what was happening to his body. It was something that disrupted his self-schema, like who he was, who he thought he was, that he couldn't think about it and didn't do anything. But also the social schemas, whether it was what his family, what his friends thought, even though some of his friends were people like me, or the AIDS doctor that was also very good friends with him, or Pulitzer Prize playwrights who wrote about AIDS that he wrote music for. So it was so hard to think about. And I kept asking my friends, my psychiatrist, I read theory, I kept going around, I was like, this doesn't really make sense. And we kept thinking about well, what did so-and-so say about what happened that one time and he did that thing? And we realized, well, he was so compartmentalized. He was private. No one actually has all that information. And then I realized I had to stop talking to people about this because it wasn't going anywhere. We were just sort of making up stories to help fit, to create a narrative to make us understand. Because the real problem was that there was no way we were ever going to know. And to have that understanding there was no way to know is sort of really upsetting. You suddenly have to embrace nothingness. And Michael had actually written a song that sort of fit this idea. It goes something like, by the time I left you, you know that I was just an echo, and you never possessed me. You never possessed me. No, I didn't know. We couldn't possess you. It was nothing that could be done. So I had to figure out what was I going to do with the cognitive dissonance of grief. Well, because what I had done was, in trying to figure out his cognitive dissonance, I was actually trying to fix my own cognitive dissonance because I had lost the schema. I had disrupted my own schema about him. I thought he was going to be there forever until I was 100, that we were going to have dinners forever. I was going to see him win Tonys and Pulitzer Prizes. It was going to be awesome, and that was never going to happen. And then I realized it was also my self-schema. I devoted my life to ending AIDS, to stopping these things from happening, and it happened anyway. So one of the things that we do around grief, if you're religious, is you have these profound ritualistic experiences. I've always been jealous of people that get to do that, not just because of heaven, but because they have a set way of going about doing things. And it creates rituals, it creates rites, ceremonies, a way of going about doing things. And what those do is they create pathways for us to create new schemas based on things that are actually happening right now. So when people say you'll feel better if you go to a funeral, you will feel better because you're developing a new way of thinking that actually helps you deal with the world. When they say go talk to someone, whether it is a therapist or a support group, yes, that'll help because when you talk with other people, you create new ideas, you create new thoughts, you create new schemas. I did a lot of writing about it. I tried to make meaning about it. I put him in my class when I talk about it. He's the patron saint of that lecture now. Picture is in my office with a bunch of ACT UP posters. And I took him to Burning Man. So I go to Burning Man every year. Lots of people think that it's all one big party. There's this other part of Burning Man, this place called the Temple. And the Temple is sort of an ephemeral memorial where every single year people go and leave offerings, create makeshift altars, messages, photos. And I was really dreading it. Dreading bringing those things of Michael there because that was actually saying goodbye. So I did it, and I posted it with my friend Cicely. The photos, put the notes, the lyrics, and she said to me, do you think he would have liked Burning Man? I was like, oh God, he would have hated it. It was ridiculous to him. And I was like, but it's because it's not about him. This is about me figuring out how to do it. And I'd asked a friend whether or not I was stepping on toes doing this, and she said, well, if Michael didn't want us to make meaning out of his death, he should not have died. And I laughed because there is some snark there, but also true. And it was because I had to make some meaning. And I had to figure it out because if Michael wasn't there to write the song, to explain everything, I had to do it myself. Thank you.